All right, everybody, welcome back and welcome to the second video um, covering the decade of the 1930s. In the last video, that's going to cover the decade of the 1930s. And as far as my AS level classes, this pretty much concludes the course as far as, information and material, given that Cambridge does not necessarily go into the details of World War II. Even when you go into your senior year, the A level, it picks up after, well, near the end of World War II, the end, after World War II. So, let's begin. Let's get this, on the way. What do we have here? This particular PowerPoint is going to focus on the presidency of FDR and the New Deal. Herbert Hoover, having fallen into the presidency um, due to the heart attack of his boss, Calvin Coolidge. He is president during the stock market crash of 1929 and the very dramatic and fast economic plunge. It started in 1929. It's going to be called the Great Depression, and that's going to last all the way into the early 40s. I believe it was the election of 1932. Herbert Hoover has a challenger. He'd ran for vice president before and lost on that ticket. Governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Yes, related to Theodore Roosevelt, but not directly. It's Eleanor Roosevelt, who was his first cousin, had more of a direct relation with Theodore Roosevelt. But yes, he was a nephew of Theodore Roosevelt, I believe, on his father's side. And it is a historical year, a catastrophic year, and there's few elections in which the choice put before the American voters is so existential, so consequential, so decisive in determining the direction of this country. And that election was one of them. The American people had two choices: stick with Hoover, have faith in what he's telling the American people, that government intervention is only going to make things worse. The market economy has a habit of regulating itself. Eventually, um, all the goods that are out there in society, will expire, will break, and demand's going to come back. It's just a matter of time. And demand comes back, money's going to start coming back into businesses. They're going to start producing and investing again. It's just, this is a tough one. We've been through them before. Just have faith. Don't let the government get involved. But there's a new generation of Americans that questions um, just how rigidly that belief should be followed. And let me talk about an economist, even though FDR denied that any of his reforms had anything to do with John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes is going to transform the face of economics, namely macroeconomics, for most of the 20th century. John Maynard Keynes was no socialist. I know it's become very popular in political rhetoric to say that FDR was a socialist. FDR was no socialist either. What Keynes did is recognize that for capitalism to survive, it had to shed this rigid belief, okay, that the market and the market alone was the best determinant of what society should produce, what consumers should buy, where, effort should be placed, where all those things, that the market alone should be the determining factor, especially when talking about the relationship between the economy and government. And Keynes, and this is, Keynes walked out of the Versailles Treaty. He's a British economist. His book was called The General Theory. And the general theory is just as impactful on the world of economics as Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations or Marx's Capital. Um, Keynes' proposition, nonsense. If the private sector cannot invest, if the private sector finds itself in a position that it could not create jobs, it could not put people in a position to produce wealth, then it falls on government. It is the responsibility of good government to do so. Not to replace private enterprise, but to do the job of private enterprise if private enterprise at the time, because of the circumstances, cannot. That is the function of good government. And if government needs to stimulate the economy to get the economy back going again, okay, so it means Keynes is no socialist. Keynes is a capitalist. Keynes wants to save capitalism from itself so that it could continue to exist. And the same could be said about Roosevelt. Save capitalism from itself so that capitalism as a whole could continue to exist. And that may mean some intervention by the public sector, by the state. And the American people had two choices. One reflected, the post-progressive era politics of this country. Throughout the 1920s, we elected nothing but right-wing, conservative, pro-business presidents, believing that what's good for business is good for government. And then catastrophe struck. And guess what happened to millions of die-hard Republican voters? They switched. There's nothing like a good crisis to help people reevaluate what they believe in, and in some cases actually switch to the other side. These are called realignments in political science, and they've happened a number of times. Okay? And crises are incredible opportunities to get people to reevaluate and sometimes convert to the other side of the spectrum. That's exactly what happens. We go from a country of die-hard conservative pro-business Republicans to a country of even more die-hard New Deal Democrats, okay, that are perfectly okay with the government getting involved. And not only that, but the government providing, okay, a variety of social services and public goods, a safety net for the people. We weren't the first to invent this. Europe was way ahead of the curve. Germany implemented universal health care in the 1880s, public education in the 1880s. We finally got around to many of the programs that had already existed in Europe 40, 50, 60 years after the fact. So we were not pioneers. We finally caught up to the European democracies, okay, and realized that much of the safety net they have over there, it wouldn't be a bad idea to bring it over here as well, particularly to ease the hardships of the Depression. FDR is the name of the man, and the New Deal is his domestic program to get people back to work, businesses up and running again, factories manufacturing again, and the economy growing again. And he has a lot on his plate. It's easy to want the presidency during easy times. But if you do that, you'll be remembered as another president. It's much harder to be president during times of crisis. But if you could manage us out of that crisis, you're going to be remembered. You're going to be one of the ones at the top of the pantheon of presidents, like FDR. So came from a wealthy family, related to Theodore Roosevelt. And here's another thing you have to consider. Throughout his entire life, he struggled with, he caught a virus when he was young. A virus that triggered a autoimmune response that over the years would leave his body deteriorated as the body fought this virus over the years. and eventually leads to paralysis and organ failure. And this virus, which was a scourge all over the world for so many years, is called polio. FDR was a lifelong sufferer of the polio virus. He was very good at hiding, but FDR slowly succumbed to this disease even throughout his presidency. And a lot has been said about why give FDR a chance and not Hoover, and that maybe the American voter felt a sense of kinship. We're suffering economically, but he's suffering too in his own way. And our shared suffering, okay, creates a kind of connection, okay? A connection that may explain why so many Americans were willing to keep FDR where he was, and so that FDR could complete what he promised that he wanted to complete, suffering as he was, which he was. And the American people were too. And you'll notice that's a lot of dates. FDR is the only president in American history that's going to win 4 consecutive elections. He does not finish his last. So FDR won the presidency in 1933. Hey, guess who else became Chancellor of Germany in 1933? It's pretty ironic. Same exact year. Nazi politician Adolf Hitler. Did you know he was elected? Well, newsflash, yes, he was. Parliamentary system, a little bit different. They had to create a coalition, and there's more of a messiness there to contend with. But it's interesting. Both countries were going through an economic hard time. The Germans was more prolonged. And we made very different choices. Very different choices as far as how to resolve this. Franklin Roosevelt won the presidency in 1933. The first 100 days of Roosevelt, very important. He said he was going to get to work and throw everything at the problem, including the kitchen sink. And whatever didn't work, he'd scrap it and he'd try something new again. He put together and he brought together the brightest minds in this country, people that were great at numbers, people that were great at policy, and helped them put together this very ambitious domestic program to alleviate the depression within those first 100 days. And it's going to be reforms in the banking system, in agriculture, programs to create new jobs. Where are you going to get all this money from? The country doesn't have any money. The economy shrank by half between 1929 and 1933. Borrowing. That's how he's going to do it, by borrowing money. Okay? And the gamble is, if I could use the money that the United States government borrows today, we'll grow the economy with that money and be in a much better position in the future to pay that money back. But we need to get that money from somewhere. And here's an image showing FDR throwing out a lot of Hoover's old ideas. So, things that Hoover believed in. Prosperity is around the corner. Rugged individualism, we still hear that one. We Americans don't need the government's help. Americans historically are rugged individuals, which is a myth, by the way. It's not real. Hoover promised a chicken in every pot. Didn't happen. So this is FDR. Let me say something very quickly. FDR, in his willingness to resolve this crisis, allowed people into and near the White House that his predecessors would not have. Okay? Many of these New Deal programs, if not outright socialist themselves, came from that end of the spectrum. Were very, maybe not based on, but inspired by socialist policies in other parts. And FDR, unlike his predecessors, is more willing to take input and bring those people into, if not near, the White House. So it was a period. Think about it, FDR, one of the first things FDR does, he's the first president In 1933, he does a couple of interesting foreign policy decisions. He recalls the troops from Nicaragua, from Haiti, and Dominican Republic. He wants to fix the relationship with Latin America. He implements the good neighbor policy, which basically he tells Latin America, you know what? The Roosevelt corollary from my uncle doesn't exist anymore. The United States does not recognize it anymore. You are free and sovereign countries. I want to fix things with you. That's actually a period of good feelings between the United States. You know, all these old guys that are just absolutely enamored with the United States, you know, Latin American guys, it's because they grew up during these years. They grew up in the 1940s. They grew up in this period in which there was the return of a very cordial, civil relationship of mutual respect during the 1940s, because that was during FDR. Um, FDR also opened up diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, something his predecessors did not do. And he led a lot of people on the left into his administration. They don't know yet. This is going to cost them dearly later on. Because in the 1950s, when we have another Red Scare and a witch hunt for supposed and real communists, a lot of the people that are going to fall, become targets, were people that were in the Roosevelt administration when it was okay to be on the left, because there was an open door to them here in this country. Well, for the FDR presidency. All right, so many government programs were created. Most of them came and went, collectively known as the New Deal. And this proved fairly successful at helping the economy. And numbers-wise, it was pretty modest. Probably, let me talk about one program, the Civilian Conservation Corps. Took thousands of homeless young men, okay, and put them to work. Fighting forest fires, that's something we have to do every year in this country. Replanting forests, okay. Conservation programs. They went and they lived in barracks-like setting. They fed them, they clothed them. Whatever money they earned, they were able to send back home. Okay. The Works Progress Administration and the very similar PWA, federal government giving money to the state governments and local governments to fund public projects, public works. And this is not just about construction. So yes, they built libraries and they built schools and they built courthouses, but they also, federal money was used to commission art, plays, concerts. Not everything is brick and mortar. Artists need to eat too. Musicians need to eat too. So Uncle Sam becomes the #1 employer in this country. The NRA was the only one that the Supreme Court got rid of. It's not the National Rifle Club. I think it was called the National Recovery Administration, and it was a volunteer. Basically, if you owned a business and you agreed to employ workers at a minimum wage for at least this many hours a week, you could put that sign on your window. And some people got upset because, oh, what about those of us that can't or don't want to? Then people are picking and choosing. And the Supreme Court said that one was unconstitutional. Okay. The TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, there was good parts of this country that had yet been electrified. Okay. The Tennessee Valley, one of the most poorest rural sections of Tennessee. The federal government spent money on doing that. FDIC, I'm going to talk about in a second. It's a New Deal program, but we're going to get to that later on. And many programs that, these were programs in the first 100 days to put people to work, doing a variety of things, and the U.S. becomes the #1 employer of unemployed persons. Like, see right there, the National Recovery Administration encouraged fair competition by setting minimum wages and maximum weekly work hours, but some business owners complained, and the Supreme Court struck it down as unconstitutional. You can't tell an owner of private property what to pay, et cetera, et cetera. But the FDR found his way around that later on. Civilian Conservation Corps and Works Progress Administration created jobs in conservation and construction. Here's young men, working in forestry. Works Progress Administration, like I said, it was, and that one, interesting projects as well because they also included murals, sculptures, art shows, concerts, you name it. And by the way, and there's an African American man in this picture. FDR also deserves a mention when you try to understand, you try to get to the bottom of how did African Americans in this country, who were Republicans since Nixon, because that made sense, how did they end up becoming Democrats? Little by little. That when it became apparent in the 1920s that the Republican Party no longer prioritized black people, but somehow, some way, FDR's New Deal programs did help black families that suffered more than white families. And I'm not going to say there was any fairness. There was unfairness and discrimination. But they could tell tangibly that the Democratic Party had delivered assistance to them, whereas the Republican Party just took their votes. That began the transition of African Americans in the North towards the Democratic Party. And for a number of years, everybody loved the Democratic Party. They were the party in power throughout the FDR years, and you could even argue up to about the mid-50s, early 50s. PWA, another similar program to the PWA, to the Works Progress Administration. Tennessee Valley Authority. That's Tennessee Valley, a very poor section of the country. Now, what about banking? Banking is a problem. Millions were left destitute because they lost their savings because of what the banks did. But you need banking. How do you restore faith in the banking system? One of the first things FDR did was call a bank holiday. He ordered all banks in this country shut for a week. Nobody's going to go in there to take their money. Okay, you're not going to lend money to anybody. Get your finances in order. The government, one of the New Deal programs, we created an insurance company for banks. From now on, you cannot hold depositors' assets without insuring those assets. The government created the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which at first was volunteer. But because they noticed that people would rather put their money in a bank that actually insures their deposits, eventually all the banks went ahead and became FDIC banks. It's a government-owned and operated insurance company that insures and guarantees the deposits of depositors in banks. There will no longer be any more bank runs and bank failures, the likes of 1929. It's right, because during the Great Recession, some banks went out of business, okay, but nowhere near the magnitude and scope that happened in 1929. How do we restore faith in the stock market? We created, essentially, a police force to police unethical and illegal activity in the stock market. Things like insider trading, for example. So we created the Securities and Exchange Commission, which worked to eliminate dishonesty in the stock market. And that one's problematic. It's kind of a joke. Okay? Because let's just say, being an agent of the SEC doesn't quite pay as well as being a stockbroker or an investor. And it's really hard. It's really hard. But that's another subject altogether. But these two programs were created to restore faith both in banking and the stock market. Let's create some more jobs. Let's create some jobs building houses. FDR created the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA. Not only help people keep their homes and keep their houses from being foreclosed, but also help people buy homes. We want people to buy homes because that's home construction. If we can stimulate home construction, we're stimulating jobs. We're stimulating jobs. We're stimulating the economy. So the FHA is set up to grant very favorable loans to Americans to buy their house for the first time. Reality, though, that was the theory. In practice, there were very highly discriminatory practices that the FHA was involved in, and African Americans particularly were quite often left out from the many benefits of the FHA. To bolster labor unions, to bolster labor union membership, the Roosevelt administration created the National Labor Relations Board as a government agency that would actually arbitrate and settle disputes between workers and employers before it would end up becoming a strike. Because strikes, frankly, are bad for business and they're bad for the economy. If the government could set themselves up as a referee and settle those disputes before a strike happens, that's actually good for both parties. So the NLRB was set up also to punish businesses that were involved in unfair labor practices. Many of FDR's programs are still with us today. You know, your grandparents are beneficiaries of this. Okay, and I want you to keep in mind, once upon a time, this did not exist. Social Security, which has been expanded over the years. In the beginning, Social Security was just about providing a pension, a government pension to individuals. I believe originally, I think you had to retire at 64 or 65. Okay? It was 64, 65, I don't know. It provided a government pension so that we don't have old people that are destitute. So we don't have our grandparents begging on the sidewalk for change, like many grandparents were forced to do during the Depression. We want to get people to believe in the banking system again and put money in the banks, because that way banks could go start loaning out money to businesses, loaning out money to people that want to buy a house and get the economy starting again. Okay. Hoover was the last time that we went through, a recession and the government did nothing. Every time we've had one since then, Republican or Democrat, we've taken the Keynesian route. Stimulus, stimulate the economy, and it's the government's route. Republican or Democrat. Nixon said it, and Nixon was a Republican. Nixon was a Barry Goldwater Republican. Came right out of Nixon's mouth. We're all Keynesians now. Okay. Social Security. So old age pension. Later on, it was extended to the disabled. You know, I got a lot of grandparents, I don't do socialism. I don't want this, I want that. But you benefit from these programs. We pay into Social Security, that's true. Unemployment insurance. That's another New Deal program. If you're out of work, government is going to pay you a portion of your paycheck until you find work again. Benefits for disability. Here was a program that the Republican Party really hated for years. Aid for Families with Dependent Children, the AFDC. Low-income families would receive money from the government per child, okay, to try to level the playing field. You know who finally got rid of that program? As derided as the AFDC was, particularly by Republicans, the guy that finally got rid of it, Democratic President Bill Clinton. Isn't that ironic? You got to be careful in times of crisis because demagogues tend to emerge claiming that the government needs to be doing more or less. Keep in mind, FDR was popular, but I hate to say radical, but because of the radical times that people were living in, radical ideologies start to reemerge. The 1930s starts to look very similar to the 1890s in the 1900s. Once again, okay, the left reemerges. But that's a tricky story because it's the left that's very much under the direction of the Soviet Union, and the right does. There are Americans, particularly German Americans, that are drawn towards Nazism. The Nazis held a huge rally in the thousands in Madison Square Garden. The fascism that's being preached in Europe, which is a rejection not just of communism, but a rejection of free market democracy, appealed to some here too. Even though FDR had his critics, such as Father Coughlin, who was pretty fascist, and Huey Long, who was on the other end of the spectrum. Huey Long was even further to the left than Franklin Roosevelt. Huey Long wanted a radical redistribution of wealth. Every man a king, that's what he called this program. And he was from Louisiana, a very conservative state today. Despite these two challengers, and Huey Long being the strongest of the challengers, FDR's presidency, as well as his party, the Democrats, became extremely popular and influential. And they're going to ride this wave practically until 1968. The American people elected FDR 4 times. Like I said, FDR was president for almost 14 years. Despite FDR's successes, the economy wouldn't really regain its strength. That's the critique, right? There's a lot of critique, especially from the right today, claiming that historians have exaggerated the impact of the New Deal, that whatever gains it made were modest, and actually there was a lot of setbacks. That historians forget that if anything really got the economy back on its feet was World War I and the demand for American war materials and financing. And maybe that's true, but you can't ignore that by 1941, before the United States even entered the war, um, the United States had already made significant gains in its economic recovery. It took a long time, 1929 to 1941. That was a very long depression. Speaking of Nazis, in 1933, the Nazis came to power. They wasted no time in showcasing and showing off the benefits of Nazism to the rest of the world. One of them was the future of passenger air travel through the use of the Zeppelin. Until the Zeppelin, the Hindenburg, crashed and burned outside Paterson, New Jersey. And that was the end of the Zeppelin. Well, it didn't have to be that way. The problem was the United States had an almost monopoly on helium deposits. The Germans didn't have access to helium, so the other lighter than air gas that they had was hydrogen. But hydrogen, as we all know, is highly, highly flammable. Had it been helium inside that Zeppelin, the result may not have been the same. Amelia Earhart, this is just like a quick fact. First woman to attempt to fly, was she first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. In 1937, she attempted to fly around the world. She disappeared somewhere around the Pacific and was never heard from again. And I think that's still true to this day. We have a park named after her in Hialeah. Music, jazz, had evolved into the swing era. This was swing jazz. What changed, Mr. Hernandez? Bigger bands, more instruments, a much, much bigger show. Now you had band leaders, okay? And so swing music was all the rage during the 1930s. Okay? Artists that we've already talked about before, like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong, that made their debut in the 1920s. But now you had Count Basie, Billie Holiday as a jazz vocalist, Charlie Parker and Miles Davis, who are going to continue to be jazz legends up into the 1960s. And then, of course, you need a white artist to sell jazz to white audiences that won't buy jazz from a black artist. You had Benny Goodman. That nonsense always happened. I'm sure everybody's heard this story. Orson Welles on radio, because back then, before TV, radio was the chief platform for entertainment at the home. You know, the living room had a radio, and people would turn on the radio and listen to programs. And he read H.G. Wells' um, War of the Worlds in 1938. Even though he claimed this was a novelization, a lot of people just didn't listen, and he caused a mass panic. And I don't know, I guess this says just how naive people were back then. But you wonder if this led to, very soon afterward, the whole UFO craze of Roswell and et cetera, et cetera. Movies in the 1930s. Despite the economy doing badly, Hollywood did very well. Hollywood did very well during these years, because I guess when you don't have a job, the next best thing to do is go to the movies, right? So, classic films like Dracula and Tarzan, Marx Brothers, King Kong, incredible special effects for the time, so did Frankenstein. Snow White, Walt Disney's first ever full-length animated film. And I think that movie took like 10 years to put together. Gangster movies like Little Caesar, Gone with the Wind, uh, musicals like 42nd Street, and probably there's a couple of color films there. Gone with the Wind is color, Snow White is color, and Wizard of Oz was, for its time, a major breakthrough in film. A true, honest to goodness, color movie in Technicolor. If you're familiar with the story of the Wizard of Oz and the novel, Dorothy wears silver slippers. They changed it into ruby in the film just to showcase this new color film that Hollywood was working with. And one more slide. Oh, look at that. We're almost done. Well, that's pretty much it, right? 1930s is a period of recovery. Do awful things happen? Yes, it's pretty much after 41. But the 1930s are a period of recovery, and Roosevelt gets elected again, 4 years, I believe that would be in 36, and elected again, I believe in 42. Um, and then I think or our numbers are off. That's pretty much the end of the course, right? And there's really nothing else to say until 1941, December 7th, 1941, when I understand that the war started in 19, I believe, 39 or something, 1939, and the U.S. is neutral. Okay, but by 1941, the U.S. is no longer neutral, and the U.S. enters World War One. But that is a story for another day in another video. So that is it, folks. That's the New Deal, and that's that's pretty much it. So, okay. Next time we talk, if I post a video, it'll be about World War II.